Hello, and welcome to the first of the Next Generation of Aerospace Medicine Lecture Series talks. I'm Joe Britton. I'm an Aviation and Space Medicine Registrar working at the RAF Centre of Aviation Medicine, and I'm also the Chair and Founder of NGAM. When we set up this organisation, our main aim was to increase access to information about this exciting field to as many people as possible, particularly focusing on students and young professionals or people early in their careers in aerospace medicine in the UK. Hopefully, this lecture series brought to you by the team of Adele, Nina and Tuba will go a good way to starting that mission. Today we're going to take a look at a brief overview of aerospace medicine and some of the topics that we look into in detail in this field through the eyes of a mission that was completed in late December 2020. So on with the show. So first of all, let's discuss the mission in question. Every year, Claus Global Distributors Incorporated undertake an annual round-world, time-critical mission. In December 2019, NGAM were approached for a review of the aerospace medical considerations of this mission that is codenamed Operation MINCEPIES. Now, whilst a lot of the details of the mission in question are clearly commercially in confidence, the Claus family gave us permission to discuss some of the key aeromedical factors that came out of this investigation, in order to help introduce more people to the world of aerospace medicine. When we were first approached, we returned with a mission statement, and that was that we wished to help them to facilitate flight in a safe manner in order to support accurate and timely delivery of seasonal cheer. And through the course of this presentation, we're going to tell you how we achieved that. But before we get into that, it's probably worth having a bit of an overview as to what the field of aviation and space medicine is all about. Now, any field in medicine requires a very good understanding of how the human body works in a normal environment and in health. And then for most clinical fields, what we then do is we apply a stressor in the form of disease. We then learn about how that disease affects that normal healthy state and what we can do to either remove that disease state or at least reduce its impact. Now, the same is true of aviation and space medicine, but the stressor we apply first of all is a new environment, be that the aviation environment, the space environment, or the various other effects of flight in and of itself. We learn about those environments, and then we learn about how that can affect our normal physiology and our normal health. Then to complete this sort of window into aviation and space medicine, if you will, we then also learn about how the disease process can affect the changes that occur in the aviation and space environment, and we can use that to either increase our support to those people if an aeromedical evacuation, for example, is required, or to choose the people that we would safely put into those environments. So back to the mission then. This graph here shows one of the key challenges that has faced Claus Global Distributors over the last 100 years. Since its founding in 280 AD, with the birth of the first St. Nicholas, the world population grew relatively steadily until around the 1600s. There was a slight increase in the linear rate of population growth over the next couple of hundred years, but it's not until the last 50 to 20 years that the world population has suddenly taken a big spike. Now, when the mission involves visiting every single household with a well-behaved child, you can see that increasing world population puts a big strain on this mission. It increases the distance needed to cover, it increases flight time, and it increases a variety of challenges. The greatest challenge posed by increasing population is due to the time limit that is placed upon this mission. In the face of more houses to go and see with each year, the only way to improve that but yet remain on time is by increasing speed. If we look at this chart of density over altitude, we can see that as a sleigh climbs, the density of the air falls. And that means if propulsion can be kept constant, I'm afraid this is one of the areas that I can't go into in detail, then speed can be increased with altitude. So to complete that goal of timely delivery of seasonal cheer, we clearly need to go higher. So to understand the effect that this might have on our sleigh pilots, we need to understand the environment through which they're going to travel. The Earth's atmosphere is split into 5 main layers. The innermost of these is called the troposphere, and it's where the vast majority of us are going to spend the vast majority of our lives. It's where all mountains are, it's where pretty much most of our weather occurs, and very few of us will ever breach the tropopause at the top of this layer, except for maybe in long periods of cruise in a long flight for holiday. Some of us who might fly in the military may spend a bit more time in this stratosphere, but are very unlikely to go higher than this. And that's not a bad thing. As we go through the layers, we start to understand a little bit more about the effects of the environment. At 330,000 feet, we reach the Kármán line, at which aircraft are no longer able to maintain their own lift using wings, etc. And this is one of the definitions of the edge of space. If you go higher still, then you reach low Earth orbit and the issues associated with microgravity. And if you continue to go further than that, then molecules in the atmosphere go further and further apart and stop interacting at all. And that's probably the true definition of deep space. And the exosphere doesn't really end, it just fades away. So for Operation MINCEPIES and the majority of aviation, we're really focusing around those two innermost layers. If you're in a light aircraft on the weekend, you're not likely to be flying much above 10,000 foot or maybe 12,500 foot for a very short period of time. If you're in a civil airliner flying across the Atlantic for your holidays, you're likely to be much higher than that, at around 38 to 40,000 foot, so right on the edge of those two layers. If you're lucky enough to fly in Concorde, or to fly faster, it had to reach areas where air was less dense, and it flew at around 60,000 foot in the cruise. If you're lucky enough to know someone in the US Air Force and get a backseat ride in the SR-71 Blackbird, well, the highest one of those has been known to fly is about half as high again at 90,000 foot. Now, I can't tell you exactly how high our sleigh pilots fly in Operation MINCEPIES, but what I can show you is a picture from one of the sleigh cams. And here you can clearly see an SR-71 Blackbird from above. And I think I should probably leave it there. So we've learned about the various layers of the atmosphere. What impact does that have on our sleigh pilot? Well, perhaps the first place to start is the changing temperature. Throughout the troposphere, the higher you go, for every 1,000 foot of altitude gained, the temperature will fall by around 2 degrees Celsius. By the time we reach the tropopause and start entering the lower levels of the stratosphere, luckily the temperature starts to stay level at a balmy minus 56.5 degrees Celsius. And it remains this in an isothermal layer for about the first 30,000 foot of the stratosphere. And then temperatures start to climb, reaching about minus 3 at the stratopause. If you continue to go higher and breach into the mesosphere, then temperature falls again relatively rapidly, but this starts to vary a bit more based on things like space weather, time of day, etc. We're really focused on these inner two most layers because that's where Operation MINCEPIES is primarily going to take place. So the lowest temperature reached by our sleigh pilot is likely to be around minus 56.5 degrees Celsius, although clearly things differ a bit based upon things like weather, latitude, etc. But it's not just the temperature at altitude that we have to think about. Operation MINCEPIES involves plenty of climbing and descending down to deliver those gifts at various parts around the world. And the hottest temperatures recorded on Earth in Death Valley are plus 54 degrees Celsius. So our mission pilots here may face a temperature range of around 100 degrees Celsius, which is, by all intents and purposes, a very wide range. So what are the impacts then on our mission crew? Well, if we start with cold, well, comfortable skin temperature, you can feel when it starts to get cold. It's one of the triggers for you to start putting on layers, seek open flames to warm yourself, close windows, etc. And comfortable skin temperature is around 32 to 34 degrees Celsius. But despite that, you've got quite a bit of headroom then before you start to cause damage to the superficial layers. Tissues freeze, so you get frostbite at around minus 0.55 degrees Celsius. But it's not just our skin and comfort that we need to think about. We need to think about what's happening deep inside the body. If core temperature falls too much, if our compensatory mechanisms, be that behavioral by putting on those layers and seeking fire, or be that through vasoconstriction and other ways and shivering and ways to adapt to cold temperature, if they don't work well enough, then our core temperature will start to fall. And as it goes below 35 degrees Celsius, hypothermia sets in. And the early symptoms are something that we can remember as stumble, mumble, fumble, and grumble. And those pretty much represent the slowing down of nerve impulses, the loss of strength of muscles. So a lot of that fine motor control, be that in with your fingertips, so you're fumbling, or be that in the lips and tongue forming sentences, or you're mumbling. But you also have some behavioural changes and dulling of the consciousness. So these grumbles and stumbling affecting your ability to do your normal task, and clearly going to have an impact on flight safety and completion of a mission. If the core temperature continues to fall and the hypothermia becomes more severe, then consciousness gets more and more depressed, heart rate slows, respiratory rate slows, and eventually a spontaneous VF arrest will occur. Clearly, fighting the cold is something that the Claus family and Claus global distributors are pretty used to. So one of the early solutions to this was a Santa suit, something like this. Fur, really, really good insulator, traps lots of air, so prevents forced convection drawing away all that nice warm air boundary layer that you build up around yourself. It also protects against conduction by covering the hands with nice thick material, so when you touch things or sit on something cold like a sleigh bench, you're not losing a lot of your heat. However, think about wearing that suit down in the Arizona desert. You're going to get hot very, very quickly, and hot can be just as bad as cold. So some of the early stages of exposure to prolonged heat can be dehydration. You can just imagine wearing that somewhere hot for some time. You're going to start to feel really quite thirsty and dehydrated. Dehydration can impair your cognitive ability, and it can reduce things like your tolerance to acceleration. Exposure to heat of the exposed skin can cause thermal tissue damage, sunburn, of course. And indeed, again, we've got to think about what's happening in the core. Exercising muscles that are starting to use up a lot of sodium and lost through sweat causes heat cramps. The sweating and dehydration and redistribution of the blood volume towards the surface, the skin, to try and lose that heat as much as possible, can cause syncope or people to pass out. And then if our increased core temperature continues, then we can enter heat exhaustion or heat stroke, the main difference being whether reversible damage to organs is done. So there is this clear balance between thermal protection in the cold environments and not having too great a thermal burden when we enter those hotter environments. And this is something that is faced by aviators who reach high altitudes in combat aircraft, even in civilian airlines, throughout time. And there are various solutions in place. For our aircraft, be that a Typhoon there or a Boeing civil airliner, one of the best ways to do this is to enclose the occupants and provide an environmental conditioning system where you can change the temperature of the air. You can try and cool it when you're down at the ground at somewhere really warm, and you can warm the air when you're up at altitude. However, that's a little bit more difficult to do in an open sleigh. So how can we get from something like this to an image we're more familiar with, like this? Well, around the 1960s and 1970s, both military, for military aviation, and NASA looked into a variety of ways to maintain the temperature for their pilots. One of the solutions they came up with is a conditioning suit, and this can either be air or liquid that is pumped around the surface of the body and can either be heated or cooled to try and maintain the thermal burden of the individual. Now, if you're in an aircraft where you have a good environmental conditioning unit, what was actually found is these aren't hugely effective because they just add another layer, more bulk, more thermal burden when they stop working. But it can be very useful in situations where you can't completely control your environment, such as on extravehicular activity for NASA, or say if you're flying a sleigh that is open to the air. So by doing this, we can reduce the bulk of the initial Santa suit to something far more like we're used to seeing on the right. And we can also mitigate for that overheating by supplying cold liquid to remove some of that increasing body heat when we're down at ground level. So we've seen that temperature initially falls as we climb to altitude, then it goes up a bit, then it goes down a bit. Well, something far more predictable when we start to climb is that pressure will fall. and it falls exponentially, with the greatest fall in pressure being in the first 1,000 feet. So that by the time we reach around 8,000 feet, we've lost a quarter of atmospheric pressure. We lose half by 18,000 feet and 3/4 by just over 33,500 feet. By the time we're reaching these sort of 100,000 feet levels that perhaps you might start to see pilots in Operation MINCEPIES, you've only got 10% of that atmospheric pressure left. And this has a wide range of issues, which we'll go into in a bit more detail. The first issue we face with falling pressure is one of gas expansion. And this involves thinking back to our GCSE or equivalent level physics and to a gentleman called Robert Boyle, who discovered that pressure is inversely proportional to volume. So if you increase the volume of something, the pressure will go down, and if you squeeze it tighter, decrease its volume, the pressure will go up, and vice versa. That means if we take a sealed unit of gas, say a balloon, and we go to altitude, as the pressure falls by 8,000 foot, that balloon will have increased in size by a third. By 18,000 foot, where half the pressure is, the balloon will have doubled in size. Well, why does this matter for our slave pilot? Well, we may not have balloons in our body, but we do have various areas where gas is trapped. One of these is our sinuses. These are air spaces in the skull designed to reduce the weight of the skull and reduce that load on our neck as we became bipedal. They can cause us all sorts of problems, particularly as we start to go to altitude. The entry and exit to those sinuses, or the ostia, are relatively small, and it doesn't take much inflammation, say through a cold or allergies, to start to block those holes. Generally speaking, as you ascend, the pressure increases, and that forces the air out of those sinuses. But if you descend quite rapidly, it's hard for the air to get back in again, and negative pressure builds up in those sinuses, and you get that pain in the front of your face, around your nose, or across your forehead that you can get when you come into landing. Air pockets can occur in teeth that have cavities, particularly those that have been filled with a little bit of air remaining. And that can be bad enough that if you lose pressure very, very rapidly, or a rapid decompression, then teeth have been known to explode in the mouth. Our guts have a lot of air produced by fermenting bacteria fermenting our foodstuff, and again, rapid changes in pressure can result in abdominal discomfort and clearly increased flatulence. Now, one of the areas of the body where we have our biggest collection of air is clearly the lungs. Now, normally these are freely ventilating, so if you lose pressure rapidly, the volume expands, but it just comes out through your airway. However, if the volume is trapped in there for whatever reason, say you're holding your breath at the time, well, that pressure can build up and it can cause the lungs to rupture. This means little pockets of gas can enter the circulation and can cause strokes, heart attacks, etc. The way anything does that can cause blockage of vessels. And this is what we call arterial gas embolism, and it can occur very rarely on rapid decompression. The next challenge that falling pressure poses is one of the greater challenges of aerospace medicine, and that is ensuring that people get enough oxygen to where it's needed most in the brain cells. Before we look into hypoxia in more detail, it's worth having a bit of a think as to what is required to get oxygen from our environment into our cells where they need to be used. So first of all, we need to acquire that oxygen. We need to take it in from the air, and we do that in our lungs at the alveoli, where it diffuses across the alveolar capillary membrane into our bloodstream. Once it's in our blood, we then need to package it to something because oxygen isn't hugely soluble. If you just had a liquid pumping around, then you wouldn't have enough oxygen to deliver to those tissues. And we do that in the form of hemoglobin, and by having red blood cells packed full of hemoglobin, we can carry far more oxygen than just serum alone. That hemoglobin, oxygen-rich blood, then needs to get around the body to all of the different parts of the body, all of the organs, all of the cells that need to receive some oxygen. Once there, the same diffusion that happens at the lungs needs to occur, but in the opposite direction, allowing that oxygen to offload to the tissues, and our oxygen dissociation curve is vital to achieving this. We're not going to go into that in too much detail today. And then finally, it's pretty useless sending the oxygen out to all of the right places if the cells can't use it. Now, any step along this chain, if it fails, can result in insufficient oxygen being delivered to tissues for them to complete their normal function, or what we call hypoxia. So if we start at the end, for example, if the cells can't use the oxygen because you've been poisoned with cyanide and the mitochondria can't function properly, then there's no point in getting all that oxygen there, and you're going to have a hypoxia that we term histotoxic hypoxia. If your blood is full of oxygen and your hemoglobin is full to bursting, but there's a blockage in the blood supply, then everywhere downstream of there won't be able to get that oxygen. And this is what we call a stagnant hypoxia or ischemia, and it's what happens in heart attacks or primarily in strokes if you have an ischemic type stroke. You can also have issues with packaging. So as I said, it's vital for oxygen to be stored in hemoglobin because the blood serum itself can't carry enough. And if there aren't enough red blood cells, or if they're not working properly, then we get a failure of oxygen packaging or an anemic hypoxia. But the one that affects us most, all of those can affect us in the aviation and space medicine environments. But the one that is most likely to affect us is due to the fall in pressure, and that is a problem with oxygen acquisition. What determines the driving force of oxygen from the lungs to the blood, or carbon dioxide from the blood to the lungs, is the difference in partial pressures. Now, partial pressure is just a fancy way of saying how much of the total pressure in that area, so say that the alveoli or the blood, is made up of the molecule in question, in this case oxygen. To work out the partial pressure of oxygen in our main airways, in the trachea, or what we call the partial pressure of inspired oxygen, we can use the following sum. We look at FO2, the fraction of oxygen, which is about 21% of the air is made up of oxygen, and we times that by the pressure at which we're breathing. So at ground level, this is around 760 millimeters of mercury. And we do a little sum to take away the pressure of water at body temperature, because by the time the air has reached our lungs, it is 100% humidified. And we put those numbers together at ground level, we see that our inspired oxygen tension is around 149.7 millimeters of mercury. Now, if we go to 18,000 foot, where the barometric pressure is half, 380 millimeters of mercury, then what we can see is that whilst the fraction of oxygen stays the same, the partial pressure of oxygen has fallen quite considerably. And for the eagle-eyed mathematicians amongst you, you may realise that the partial pressure of oxygen at 18,000 feet, where barometric pressure is halved, is actually even lower than half. And that's because water has the same 47 millimeters of mercury that we take away from the barometric pressure at any given altitude. And as the barometric pressure falls, the effect of that 47 millimeters of mercury being taken away has a higher relative effect. Well, why is this important? So to figure that out, we need to go a little bit further into the lungs, into the alveoli, and looking at the partial pressure of oxygen there, or the PAO2, alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. And we can work that out from our inspired partial pressure of oxygen by taking into account the carbon dioxide that's in the alveoli as it diffuses out of the blood into the lungs to be exhaled. And there's an equation down the bottom right corner for those of you who want to think about that in that level of detail. So to get the oxygen from the alveoli into the blood, it needs to diffuse across the alveolar capillary membrane. The law that governs how well this occurs is called Fick's law, and there's lots of things that it takes into account: surface area, the thickness of that membrane, diffusion coefficients, etc. But the one that we're going to focus on here is the key thing, which is the driving force, which is the difference between the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood. And it's that diffusion gradient that gives the driving force to push the oxygen into the blood. Now, as you can see here at ground level, you've got a very high alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. It's pretty low in the venous circulation, and by about a third of the way along the capillary, you've reached equilibrium, so the blood in the lungs now has as much oxygen as the air in the alveoli. When we go to altitude, the partial pressure falls, our inspired partial pressure of oxygen falls, and hence our alveolar partial pressure of oxygen falls. This means that that difference between alveolar tensions and venous tensions has massively reduced. So that gradient, that driving force, is much smaller. Now this has two key effects. The first of all is that the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is lower, so the equilibrium level, the highest you could ever get in your arterial side of the lung, is going to be much smaller. But it also means is that driving force diffusion across the alveolar capillary membrane is much slower. That means it takes the majority of the distance of that capillary for equilibrium to be reached by the time you reach a certain altitude. Therefore, if you increase your cardiac output, you increase the speed of the blood passing through the capillaries, you may have some hemoglobin, some red blood cells, that leave the lungs before even reaching equilibrium. So you get a double hit, a double impact on hypoxia, which is worse if you're exercising. To understand how hypoxia is going to affect our delivery of our mission statement, facilitating flight in a safe manner, an accurate manner, then we need to think about how it affects the brain. The failure to deliver adequate oxygen to the cells in the brain start to cause cognitive effects as low as around 5,000 feet. At this point, it's really affecting vision at night time, decreasing the light sensitivity in a dark adapted eye. If you climb a bit higher without any protection, then by 8,000 foot, novel tasks, new things that you haven't practiced much, start to be affected. That's partially because your short-term memory and your ability to form those memories is reduced. At about 10,000 foot, then even well-practiced tasks, things that you've done time and time again, start to be affected. And that's why we don't tend to fly above 10,000 foot without protection for long at all. It's also the altitude at which your body starts to think, I should probably do something about this hypoxia, and kicks your respiratory drive into gear, causing hyperventilation, blowing off CO2, and resulting in a respiratory alkalosis. If you continue to go higher by about 12,000 feet, then we can see some marked different difficulties in our normal flight tasks, such as a 10% decrease in your ability to maintain heading, airspeed, and vertical velocity. If you carry on even higher, then that short-term memory is really being affected now, but 75% as good as it was at ground level. And blowing off all that carbon dioxide has started to have an effect with some tremors, tingling in the lips, and all of these things adding it together to make it harder to control your aircraft. But sort of a little bit higher, 16 to 18,000 foot, reaction time is hugely affected, and pursuit type tasks following other targets flying in formation are going to be clearly quite badly impacted. Around 25,000 foot, thoughts will be slowed, emotional state will be affected, people quite often feel euphoric, almost a drunk-like state. At this time, sudden loss of consciousness can also occur. And all of these effects depend on how quickly you get there, how long you get there, and lots of other individual factors. But the thing to really be aware of is that most people, because hypoxia affects the brain itself, are completely unaware of these symptoms occurring. And that can have a real issue in trying to correct for this hypoxia. There's a famous poem, High Flight, by John Gillespie Magee Jr. And this is one that is told by aviators around the world. And it's always seen as a sign of the freedom of flight, flying up along the clouds without a care in the world. This poem was actually written after a flight to 33,000 foot in a Spitfire, which wasn't really built with a decent enough oxygen system to protect at that height. And you can see in some of these phrases that I've highlighted, the long delirious burning blue, silent lifting mind, reaching out and touching the face of God. It's felt that actually what John Gillespie Magee Jr. is describing here is the euphoria of hypoxia. And whilst I can't include it here, what I would suggest is you go to our hypoxia tutorial and you look for the video by Destin from Smarter Everyday on hypoxia, where he goes in a hyperbaric chamber and shows some of these symptoms firsthand, because seeing it even in a video or in real life is a really good way to get your mind around what happens in hypoxia and just how dangerous it can be. But clearly all of those symptoms are not conducive to a safe or an accurate flight. So we need to protect our sleigh pilot from hypoxia. So if we go back to our equation looking at the partial pressure of inspired oxygen, We note that the barometric pressure falls when we ascend to altitude, but the fraction of oxygen stays the same, 21%. So one of the easiest ways to protect against hypoxia is just to increase that fraction of oxygen, increase the percentage, give people higher percentage oxygen to breathe. Now to do so, we need to come up with an oxygen system, and this requires a source, a way of taking the oxygen with us to somewhere where there is a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. And we can do that via compressed gas or through liquid oxygen, which has all of these different sources have different pros and cons. Or indeed, we can even generate some oxygen up in the altitude by using a molecular sieve oxygen concentrator, which traps the nitrogen, only allowing oxygen and balance of argon to go through into the breathing gas. Then once we've got our oxygen, we need to have some pipework, and as you can see from those cylinders, it takes quite a lot of space to carry much oxygen, or it needs a lot of power to generate that oxygen through a molecular sieve. So what we want to do is we want to regulate when and where and how much of that oxygen is being breathed. We want to make sure that the 2/3 of the respiratory cycle that is breathing out, you're not just getting oxygen blown in the face, which is being wasted. We also want to make sure that we're not giving too much oxygen at lower altitudes, not only because it's a waste, but actually breathing too high percentage of oxygen carries all sorts of problems. So we have a regulator, and this adjusts, which means it only gives the oxygen when you breathe in through a variety of mechanical or electronic valves, and also adjusts that percentage of oxygen that you're giving, either by changing how your molecular sieve works or by mixing it with some cabin air for a set altitude. And then you need some pipe work, and you need a way of delivering that oxygen to the sleigh pilot. And you can do that through the variety of different systems that you would expect to see in a hospital. A mask, best not, but you can use nasal cannulae, pump it into a helmet, pump it into the box that you're sitting in. One of the key issues with oxygen systems is it's all very well having one there, but if it doesn't work and you don't use it, then it's no good. This image is from the Zenith balloon disaster, in which Tissandier was trying to reach an altitude record and perform some meteorological studies. So he went in a balloon trying to go the highest that anyone ever had. He was well aware of the hypoxia problem and reducing pressures, so he approached his friend Paul Bert, who's perhaps the grandfather of aviation medicine, for a solution. And they trained in his hyperbaric chamber, and they brought with them a cylinder of oxygen. You can see just around the center of that image there. However, what you can also see his two fellow pilots who appear to be collapsed. And unfortunately, in this event, despite having an oxygen system, all three men on this balloon lost consciousness due to hypoxia, and only one survived. There are two theories why this happened. The first is that because of those symptoms of hypoxia that we discussed, the men were unaware of their symptoms before it was too late, and they were unable to correct for their own hypoxia. They had exceeded what we call their time of useful consciousness. Another theory is that the oxygen system itself failed. We learned that as we go to altitude, the temperature starts to fall. We've also learned that our breath is fully 100% humidified in our lungs. So is our expirate. It's full of water vapor. So when you breathe out through the same tube that you're breathing in, that water vapor in your expirate starts to freeze, and tubes, this was just delivered through effectively a metal straw, or valves of oxygen masks can freeze shut. That prevents the rest of the system working, and hypoxia can occur. And clearly, if you go mountaineering, you can see that frost, etc., starts to develop, particularly in the more moist areas around the eyes and on the moist face covering that's had an expirate being blown through it. And one of the early challenges for developing oxygen systems and oxygen masks, such as this Type D mask in the RAF, was trying to come up with a way of preventing those expiratory valves from being too cold and freezing. And one of the solutions was to heat those valves or make sure they're well covered. So when the Claus family first faced this challenge a number of years ago, one of the initial considerations was to wrap up the pilot very warm, have a big bulky oxygen system, oxygen delivery device that would prevent those valves from freezing. But you can just imagine what would happen if a child woke up and at the foot of the chimney they saw someone looking a bit like a sand person from Star Wars. So instead, what was suggested is using the image that comes with Santa, this traditional view of a bearded gentleman, and instead of actually requiring every Santa pilot to have a beard, instead using that image of a beard as a way to insulate and maintain the heat around the oxygen system. So we can use the image and actually utilize that as part of our protection. So we've fixed the issue of hypoxia then. Well, unfortunately not quite. As we said, hypoxic symptoms that start to become more relevant really kick in at around 10,000 feet, affecting our ability to perform safe flight. So we can increase the fraction of oxygen. And if we give 100% oxygen, we can go to about 34,000 feet, breathe 100% oxygen, and we've got the partial pressure in our alveoli that's about equivalent to breathing normal air at ground level. It doesn't take much more altitude, only up to 40,000 feet, however, to get the same symptoms you'd get at 10,000 foot on air on 100% oxygen. So 40,000 foot is an equivalent altitude on 100% oxygen to 10,000 foot on air. So really, to go much higher than that, we would start to experience more and more severe hypoxia symptoms that are going to affect our ability to fly an aircraft. And as you can see, Concorde, SR-71 and our Santa sleighs can travel at much higher altitudes than this. So something else needs to be done, and it's not just hypoxia that we need to worry about. If we reach altitudes as high as 63,000 foot, there is another imaginary line in the sky, and this is called Armstrong's line. Here, the barometric pressure falls to 47 millimeters of mercury, and you might recognize that number from the water portion of our inspired oxygen pressure equation. Because 47,000 foot is the tissue vaporization pressure of water at body temperature. All sounds very fancy, but effectively what this means is if you go any higher than that, as the pressure falls, water will start to change from a liquid state to a gaseous state. Even less fancy, your tissue fluid starts to boil. And we can see that in this clip here. As a vacuum is built up in the outer container, the fluid in the inner container turns to a gaseous state and appears to boil. And if that occurs in the body, it's something known as ebulism, and it's clearly something that we want to avoid. So if we want to go higher than 40,000 feet, we've maxed out our increasing the fraction of oxygen, so what else in that equation can we change? Well, how about we go to the source of the problem, pressure itself. So we can increase the pressure locally. And this is the theory behind cabin pressurization systems. So here is the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, the first commercial aircraft to have a pressure cabin. And here's something you're probably a bit more familiar with, a Boeing 787, sat inside your nice pressurized cabin environment. And this means that you're not exposed to that outside air. You can control the environment via an environmental control unit, like we talked about earlier. And you can have a shirt sleeve environment. You can get on there in the same clothes that you're wearing at ground level and fly as high as 38,000 feet. Clearly that's impossible with a design of a sleigh something like this. So what you might find is that a modern Santa sleigh perhaps starts to look a bit more like something familiar to us. But in a theme you might start to see the more you look into aerospace medicine, when we create a solution to a problem, we tend to introduce new problems entirely. And by causing a pressure craft, we then introduce the risk of a rapid decompression. So an aircraft at high altitude is effectively a pocket of increased pressure in a surrounding low pressure. So P internal is much higher than P external. And the difference of that depends on your pressurization schedule. So against common belief, you're not at ground level equivalent in a civilian airliner going across the Atlantic. You're actually at around an equivalent of 8,000 foot, or for some more modern aircraft, about 6,000 foot. And your differential is the difference between that 8,000 foot inside the aircraft and the 38,000 foot outside the aircraft. Now, if for whatever reason, say a defect occurs in the surface of that aircraft, then the high pressure inside the aircraft is going to want to try and equilibrate with the low pressure outside, and a rush of air will occur through that defect to the outside. And that can cause all sorts of problems. We've already talked about the effects of rapid pressure drop in terms of gas expansion and the pain and discomfort that can cause, or perhaps even rupture of lung tissues if severe enough. But there's something else that happens deeper in our body. And to look at that, we need to have a bit of a think about what happens when you open a bottle of Coke. So a bottle of Coke, or any other fizzy carbonated drink, other brands are available, is effectively the same as an aircraft. Now, I can see that you're starting to think I've gone mad, but what I mean is that the internal pressure of that vessel is much higher than the surrounding pressure. And what makes a drink fizzy is the fact that there's an awful lot of carbon dioxide dissolved in the liquid. And the amount of carbon dioxide that can be dissolved in the liquid of your carbonated beverage is proportional to the pressure of carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the gas above that liquid. So that little bit of the bottle that's full of spare gas. And this is known as Henry's law. So what happens when you open the top of your bottle? Well, you introduce a defect in that bottle, much like in the aircraft skin on the picture on the right, and the two pressures equilibrate. Now, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air above your liquid has suddenly dropped to be equal to the external pressure, so the amount of carbon dioxide that can be dissolved in that solution falls rapidly. It tends to form bubbles, comes out of solution, bubbles out of the top of that liquid. And you can see what it looks like here. Now, in the body, we're less worried about carbon dioxide. 79% of our air is made up of nitrogen, and our tissues and our blood are chock full of this stuff. So if pressure falls rapidly enough, generally speaking to half of normal pressure, which is around 18,000 foot from mean sea level, or you spend long enough time at a high enough altitude, then that nitrogen starts to come out of the tissues and form bubbles in the blood. Those go around the circulation and cause a wide range of effects. And this is something called evolved gas disease or decompression sickness. And there are 4 key symptoms associated with it. The bends occur when these bubbles form in the joints. And this is more common in divers, causing pain on returning to the surface, or as in the picture here, in Caisson's disease, which was in workers for early bridges, where they worked on the foundations deep under the riverbed. And when they came up and the pressure fell, they tended to get some joint pain. The creeps occurs when the bubbles forms in the skin, and it causes a rash called cutis marmorata. The chokes are when the bubbles form in the lung, preventing delivery of blood to the highly oxygenated areas of the lungs and forming a perfusion mismatch, or just damaging the tissue in and of themselves. And the staggers occur when bubbles form in the brain and the spinal cord, predominantly the white matter, resulting in blockage to neural transmission and a wide range of varied neurological symptoms. The symptoms of decompression sickness can range from very mild, that fully resolve on descent of the aircraft as pressure increases, to permanently disabling, and some that require treatment in a recompression chamber for many hours after return to ground level. It's felt that decompression sickness is very rare below 18,000 foot, but the evidence around this is quite hard. It's clearly not something that's ethical to study, and it's certainly something that we like to avoid. So pressure cabins are part of the solution to decompression sickness. If you went without a pressure cabin, even if you could prevent hypoxia somehow by delivering enough oxygen into the lungs and into the blood, you still would face this risk of decompression sickness. So by putting someone in a pressure cabin, we can reduce that risk, go higher for longer. If we go high enough and there is a great enough risk that that cabin may lose pressurization, then we can add an extra layer of protection through the way of a full pressure suit. And effectively, just think of this as a secondary pressure cabin, a backup pressure cabin that is applied much, much closer to the person, in fact, in the shape of a normal flying suit. And generally speaking, these aren't active at normal altitudes whilst flying normally, but in the event of a rapid decompression of the cabin, these suits will inflate rapidly, apply pressure directly closely to the skin and the airways, and in that way avoid the nitrogen bubbles coming out, avoid ebulism occurring if you're above 63,000 feet, and prevent hypoxia by delivering pressurized air directly into the airways. And you can see how these designs have developed over time. In the center, one of the first ever pressure suits, which looks very similar to diving suits that inspired a lot of the early work. On the left, something more similar, but clearly of an earlier form, and on the right, a launch suit for the space shuttle. So in the face of these challenges associated with high altitude flight, how did we achieve that safe and accurate flight that we promised in our mission statement? So this is the solution we came up with. And first of all, this is a little bit of a glimpse into the truth behind Santa. Santa is very much always portrayed as a gentleman with a big white beard, we've already discussed that, but also someone who's perhaps on the higher end of the BMI scale. But the truth of the matter is this is a silhouette of the current Santa. And that bulk is made up by some of our protection systems. So we've discussed we can deliver oxygen through a mask with a fur covering to prevent freezing of those expiratory valves. That oxygen requires a source. Well, luckily Santa carries around his sack, so it can carry around one of the various types of oxygen source or generating systems. We also have discussed how a pressure suit is probably required, and that still needs to be applied over the head and the neck. By doing so through a helmet, you can also provide impact protection if the worst was to happen. Now, the first layer that starts to bulk out our sleigh pilot is those liquid conditioning suits and insulated layers that we discussed when talking about temperature. And that means that not only can they operate in a cold environment, particularly if pressure in that cabin is lost, but also can be maintained at a comfortable temperature at lower, hotter areas. And then we need to apply a pressure suit, a pressure jerkin to the upper half of the body and pressure trousers to the lower half of the body. And to top it all off, we need to make sure that our pilot is protected in as many circumstances as possible. If a fire was to occur in the aircraft or after an accident, then we'd want some protection against that. So we can use modern materials that are fire resistant to protect on the outer layer, and all of that insulation adding air pockets acts as a really good way to reduce some of that heat transfer if they had to escape through a fire. Clearly the challenges of altitude go further than just hypoxia, gas expansion and pressure differences. And here are just some of the aeromedical factors that we had to take into account in Operation MINCEPIES. Things like cosmic radiation, exposure to ozone, psychological factors of being in big wide open blue sky. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of these in detail, but perhaps we'll cover these in a future lecture. So far we've talked about the effect of going higher to allow our sleigh pilot to travel faster. We've not yet covered the effects of traveling faster itself. So let's move on to acceleration and g-forces. So as our sleigh kicks into gear and accelerates forward, the pilot feels Newton's third law in action, the equal and opposite reaction pushing them into the back of their seat. And we've all felt that before if we accelerate in a car quickly enough. Now if we take the acceleration in meters per second squared and we divide it by the acceleration that is normally put upon us by Earth's gravity of 9.81 meters per second squared, then we talk in terms of g. Now g can be felt in three axes or a combination thereof. If the vehicle accelerates forwards and we feel like we're pushed into our seat, that's called positive gx. And if it decelerates and we get thrown forward, that's negative gx. If for reasons we'll discuss in a moment, the acceleration is in an upward direction, we feel that force going from head to toe, and that's positive gz. And if it's going left or right, then that's positive or negative gy. So our sleigh pilots clearly experience some positive gx as the craft accelerates. And whilst this can cause some issues with, say, respiration, making the chest wall feel heavier and harder to breathe at high levels, it's not the type of g that we're most concerned about. That's positive gz. As you can see, aircraft turn by pitching towards the centre of that turn. And in doing so, they create centripetal acceleration towards the centre of that turn. What the pilot feels, therefore, is the centrifugal reaction, an acceleration in the head-to-toe direction, or positive GZ. If we think back again to our GCSE or equivalent level physics, we know that weight is equal to mass times acceleration. Now, normally that acceleration is due to gravity, but if we accelerate hard enough in an aircraft, we can increase that. So at 9g, everything, including our blood, weighs 9 times what it does at 1g. So what does that mean? So for all of us sitting as we are, there is a pressure gradient through the column that is our circulation, the column of fluid, and that is proportional to the density of that fluid times by the height of that column, so however tall we are when seated, and the acceleration caused by gravity. This equation, the pressure is at any point in that column is rho times h times g. Now if we increase g, then we increase the gradient of this hydrostatic pressure. So above our 0 point at the heart, the pressure starts to fall. And that means by about 3.2 to 4.5 G, depending on how long your neck is, the arterial pressure at head level falls to 0 millimeters of mercury, and perfusion starts to slow and ceases. The opposite is also true. Below the heart, the pressure increases. So at 9G, the blood pressure in your feet, just purely based on the physics of the hydrostatic gradient, is around 1,000 millimeters of mercury. Because the pressure increases inside your vessels without any increase in pressure outside the vessels, they all stretch. And that means they can now take up more volume, which means that the volume is redistributed away from the heart and the head, where it's really important, and into the abdomen and the legs. And this drops not only the blood pressure at head level, purely due to this hydrostatic gradient, but also the blood pressure at heart level from which that drop occurs. So it's a double hit. If these two things combine and cerebral blood flow ceases, then after about 4 seconds, which is the amount of oxygen that's just stored in the blood that sat there, loss of consciousness, or what we call G-LOC, will occur. And it looks something like this. That blood flow ceasing to the brain, loss of consciousness occurring, loss of muscle tone, and you can see the student pilot slumping forward at the controls. What you can't see here, in this clip particularly well, is that there's a period of full incapacitation for about 15 seconds, followed by a period of relative incapacitation where you still can't control the aircraft. That can last for another 30 seconds. And that's only if the G is let off when consciousness is lost. So clearly, that's not very good if you're trying to fly an aircraft. Not only are you no longer in control of that aircraft, but some of those muscular movements can affect your flight controls, and that period of relative incapacitation as the G comes off means that it's about 45 seconds after a G-LOC episode before you're fully in control of that aircraft again. An aircraft can travel very, very quickly towards the ground. So we need to protect against it. And we can do that with anti-G suits like these, which effectively are air-filled bladders that apply pressure to the outside of the abdomen and lower limbs. As we said, without a G-suit, the pressure increases in the vessels and there's no increase on the outside, so they all dilate. With a G-suit, we increase the pressure on the outside to some extent, and that limits the expansion of those capacitance vessels, and it prevents some of that blood pooling in the lower limbs. And the abdomen, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that is fundamentally. The other thing we can do is perform a maneuver called the anti-G straining maneuver to try and replicate some of those effects of an anti-G suit. This consists of continuous muscle tensing of every muscle group from the abdomen down to the toes, and that's to be rock solid from before the G comes on. On top of that, you need to do a breath strain maneuver that you can see slightly happening in this clip, and that's a Valsalva maneuver, so a forced expiration against a closed glottis, pressurizing the chest. And that has to be held for no more than 3 seconds, and then a short, sharp breath exchange, not only to breathe, but also because if you hold that pressure in the chest for much longer than 3 seconds, you start to impede the blood coming back towards the heart and paradoxically make your G protection a lot worse. As you can guess, this requires a lot of training, as we can see a clip of here, and if you get it wrong, it can make things worse than they were beforehand. It's also very tiring. It can distract from the primary flight roles. So clearly we're going to teach our slave pilots an excellent anti-G straining manoeuvre and practice that throughout the year, first of all in the centrifuge, building up to practicing it in flight. But what we also want to make sure is that they've got the best possible G trousers. And that seems to be all about increasing bladder coverage. So if we improve it from the 30% cover of the original skeletal bladdered G suits to close to 90% of the legs and the abdomen covered in modern full coverage anti-G trousers, we can improve the G protection. And it seems that abdominal coverage is potentially the most important by squeezing the large splanchnic circulation where lots of blood pooling can occur. However, even with the best current protection, which not only uses the anti-G straining manoeuvre, G trousers, but also applies positive pressure into the airways, directly helping that compression of the chest, most people can only manage about 9G for any real sustained amount of time, and even then you start to get tired quite quickly. Well, we can work out how much acceleration a slave pilot is likely to achieve by looking at the velocity at which they have to travel, squaring it, and dividing that by the radius of their turn. So someone else has done this maths, but to deliver to all homes in the world, assuming every child's been good this year, Santa has to travel at 1,050 kilometers per second. Therefore, to keep G under 9, the minimum turn radius, so the tightest that can turn a sleigh, would be 12 million kilometers. Unfortunately, the circumference of the Earth is only 40,000 kilometers. So it's not unsurprising that we have paintings and stories from the Claus collection of Santa having episodes of G-lock. Unfortunately, I can't go into the full solutions of how we have achieved this because that's really the sensitive part behind how Operation Mince Pies actually came together. And unfortunately also we don't have time to cover all of the other areas that we had to consider when writing our report for the Claus family. I can give you a brief hint of some of the other topics that aviation medicine and space medicine cover and the things that we had to consider. So we need to think about issues such as fatigue. This is a long trip, 24 hours of pretty much constant work, including shift patterns, changing time zones frequently. And we need to think about things like fatigue, so how we balance up that homeostatic drive, so our decrease in alertness from the moment we wake up, with the circadian pattern throughout the day, and we try and reduce the risk of fatigue causing accidents in those periods of dips. We also needed to think about how we could ensure that our sleigh pilot and crew were able to escape the sleigh if it were to have a fault, if the engines or propulsion system was to fail, or an accident were to occur. So crew escape systems like ejection seats had to form a part of our considerations. And then we also need to think about that bottom right hand box of the aerospace medicine window, the impact of potential disease. Now coming into this project, thinking about Santa the same as I'm sure all of you did before this presentation, my main consideration was going to be around obesity and the diseases that can be associated with that, such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease, particularly coronary artery disease. The main issue in terms of medical impact on aviation is the risk of sudden incapacitation, that any condition, be that due to a heart attack or epilepsy or even a migraine preventing anyone from controlling an aircraft, that could occur suddenly in flight without warning and prevent safe control of that vehicle. Luckily, as we learnt, actually our sleigh pilots are fit and healthy, strapping young men and women who are at the prime of their physical fitness. Then we also need to think about the impact of just being human. Humans make mistakes, and a variety of different environments and situations can make those mistakes more likely to occur, particularly when workload is high, when there is stress of time delays and time restrictions on a mission. We really need to start thinking about how we can minimize all of those triggers that might make an accident more likely. And that is the study of human factors and ergonomics that we needed to go through before this mission. So that's an overview of a few topics that we covered for Operation Mince Pies and a bit of a cover over the ones that we weren't able to go through today. I'd just like to draw a few lessons out from this. First of all, that the application of aerospace medicine knowledge is context dependent. So one system that may work in certain scenarios, be that a thermal conditioning suit that works great for Santa but not so good for fighter pilots, or a full pressure suit which is quite good in this scenario but would just add unnecessary bulk if you're flying in a commercial aircraft. So you have to understand the environment, how to counter that environment, and when different types of solutions are appropriate. And to be able to do that, as I said, you need to be able to understand the environment itself. You need to know the challenges well, and you need to know the impact of those on physiology and how we can minimize that to try and make as much as possible it close to that healthy person in the ground environment. The other thing we sort of touched on is that every time you come up with a solution to a problem, you tend to introduce new ones. Be that by trying to protect against cold, increasing thermal burden, or be that by trying to protect against pressure, creating a whole new risk, that of rapid decompression. And I think what we've also learnt, hopefully today, is that people aren't always what they appear to be at first. Thank you very much for listening to this first in our lecture series from the next generation of aerospace medicine. If you'd like to learn more or ask any questions, we have our live chat available now. And if you can't make that or you haven't been able to catch this video live, please do feel free to find me on Twitter and ask any of those questions you may have. Of course, I still can't tell you exactly how Santa manages to deliver all his presents to every child in the world and remain conscious. But anything about aerospace medicine, I'm more than happy to try my best to answer. Thank you very much. My last note is just to say, please do, if you've enjoyed this, and hopefully even if you haven't, please do get involved with the next generation of aerospace medicine. We've got some really good projects coming up looking into how we can further spread the information about aerospace medicine in the UK, how we can include it in some of our training pathways for medical students and other healthcare professionals, and how we can best facilitate learning and sharing of information across the aerospace medicine community. So please do look at our website, send us an email if you're interested in our mailing list, or join us on Twitter. Thank you very much.